Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Anabel González, non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to Trade Winds, our bi-weekly virtual event series, where we discuss the future of global trade in the era of the COVID-19 pandemic with leading policymakers and experts from across the world. So Trade Winds episodes normally run on the first and third Wednesday of each month, and we're delighted to have a large and diverse audience spanning now over 80 countries from all regions. So today I would like to recognize our participants from the Asia Pacific region, which so far have come from 16 countries, from Australia to Bangladesh, from India to Korea, from China to Nepal, all over Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, New Zealand, and certainly, of course, Singapore. So in this, our episode number 9 of Trade Winds, we will explore the topic, can digital trade agreements spur the next round of growth? A theme that has become particularly critical to the economic recovery in the context of the pandemic. So to lead our conversation today, I am very pleased to have with us two great speakers. Let me first introduce His Excellency Chun Singh, Minister for Trade and Industry in Singapore, where he is responsible since 2018 for driving economic and industrial development. He is also Deputy Chairman of the People's Association. Minister Chan has had a long and eminent career in government, holding ministerial positions in portfolios as diverse as social and family development, defense, community development, and information communication and the arts. He's also had a distinguished trajectory in the Singapore military, where he rose through the ranks to become Chief of Army, the top job in the armed forces. I'm also delighted to present Caroline Atkinson, member of the executive committee of our own board of directors at the Peterson Institute. Caroline is internationally renowned in economic policy circles, having served as Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics in the Obama administration, among other distinguished positions in the Bank of England, the International Monetary Fund, and the US Treasury. More recently, Caroline was the head of global policy and chief policy advisor at Google, where she led the company's work on all issues related to the digital economy. So welcome to both of you, Minister Chang and Caroline. I'm delighted to have you here, and thank you very much for being at TradeWinds. I will come to you in a few minutes. Let me now remind our audience to please get ready to submit your questions using the Q&A feature in the platform, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. So let me say a few words to set the context of our discussion. So in 2018, our colleagues at the Peterson Institute, Gary Hufbauer and Lucy Liu, estimated that international digital flows had already taken the lead role in bolstering world economic growth, compensating for lethargic conventional trade and FDI flow. So today, amid lockdowns and other containment measures that restrict the movement of persons and goods, digital technologies have kept trade flowing in the age of the pandemic. So according to the OECD, as consumers shifted from in-person shopping to ordering goods and services online, online orders during the first quarter of 2020 were up 70% year on year in Asia Pacific, while in North America, online orders at the end of May were up 120% year on year. In Europe, they were up in Europe, they were up 50% on average. So everything from cross-border e-commerce and digital payments to teleconferencing with business partners around the world, to replacing physical documents with electronic records, digitally enabled transactions in goods and services is more important than ever. So we know that digitalization increases the scale, the scope, and speed of trade, enabling both large and small firms in advanced and emerging economies to benefit. According to the OECD, as consumers shifted from, we know that basically small and large firms can participate in trade, benefiting from reduced fixed cost of exporting, greater visibility, easier market access, and less costly distribution. So a recent report of the World Economic Forum highlights that with a higher share than average of women's ownership and management in the tech sector, the digital economy helps women entrepreneurs access global markets. And we also know that digital technologies facilitate the rise of cross-border trade in services. But while COVID-19 has accelerated the move to the digital economy, trade confrontations and protectionism risk fragmenting markets and limiting the benefits of electronic commerce. New restrictions continue to arise, including the Team Network program recently announced by the US, aimed at discouraging the use of Chinese technologies, followed by several actions to limit the use of popular Chinese apps. And China is responding with a counter initiative of its own. But interestingly, Singapore is going in a different direction. So I would like to now turn to you, Minister Chun, and ask you that to promote greater trade cooperation, Singapore is leading the negotiation of digital trade agreements. So what are Singapore's objectives in shaping a new digital trade architecture? And again, welcome, Minister.
Thank you, Anabel. Let me thank you once again for allowing us to join you in this discussion. Perhaps for today, in answering your question, let me set out 3 propositions to get us thinking about this issue. First proposition, I think the world is at a crossroad, as you have mentioned. We have to choose between digital integration or digital fragmentation. And our choice will determine the global growth trajectory for the next few decades. So that's my first proposition. The second proposition is that the US is at a historical juncture to determine its role and responsibilities as a global power in the coming decades. And the choice that the US made in the digital space will have a serious implication on its global leadership role in the coming decades. And my third proposition today, just to tickle our minds, is that global corporations have both roles and responsibilities in determining the outcome of the first and the second proposition, meaning the path that we choose between integration and fragmentation, and the US continued leadership role in the global world order. Now, let me start on the first one, on the first proposition, on the crossroads. I think over the last few months, many of us would have realized the importance of digital connectivity. And the COVID-19 situation has accelerated our understanding of this phenomena and our dependence on this medium. So digitalization has transformed the way we do business and transformed the way we trade. And there will be consequences for global trade and how the global system will continue or not continue to uplift millions from poverty in the coming decades. But to be fair, we must also accept that the rise of digitalization and globalization have resulted in different outcomes for different segments of our population. And because of that, some who have or believe that they have not gained as much as they expected have come to resist both globalization and digitalization. So today the world is at a crossroad. One for digital protectionism, fragmentation and isolation, and another one for greater integration augmented by digital connectivity and inclusion. Now let me start with the dangers of digital protectionism. Around the world, more and more countries are installing barriers to digital trade and cross-border data flows, such as through custom duties and data localization requirements. Some out of fear for their own security, others out of a desire for a greater share of the potential fiscal revenues. And this is particularly salient for countries that are fiscally challenged. On the other hand, for all the promise of the digital economy, there are legitimate concerns regarding data privacy, cybersecurity, and intellectual property protection. And we must be upfront that all countries will require domestic adjustments when they embrace globalization, just as when they embrace digitalization and greater digital connectivity. We will need to prepare our workforce to make the necessary adaptations, upskilling them, helping our companies to pivot to new markets, overcome the digital divide, and also to see how we can have a fair playing field between local and foreign competition in the digital space. So while we address all these issues, and these are relevant issues to be addressed, we must make a choice. Do we make the bold step towards greater integration while managing these challenges? Or do we move backwards and not go for integration, but instead to erect more digital barriers? I think that is the choice that we have ahead of us. And that choice will determine the global economic growth trajectory in the coming decades. Our decision should be guided by economics and technology, and hopefully not by politics. If we take an economic approach to this issue, we will all understand that the digital economy should not and will not be a zero-sum game. But it is one where we have potentially increasing returns to scale. As we share more data, we are able to produce better and higher quality products and services for our people to everyone's benefit. The second proposition, which has to do with the US leadership, the US global leadership in the next lap of global development. The US now has a historical opportunity to lead the world down this path of digital integration, connectivity, assurance, and inclusion. It would be fair to say that if physical trade has cemented the US global preeminence in the last century, digital connectivity will determine the US leadership in the current century. The next phase of global growth will be driven by both digital trade and conventional trade underpinned by digital means. As you have mentioned, some studies have shown that the digital economy grew by 2.5 times faster than global GDP over the previous 15 years. And that's just the start. And it could grow another 15.5% today to 24.3% by 2025. These are probably conservative estimates. All these will be accelerated by the next wave of digital economy developments when we adopt 5G, robotics, artificial intelligence, and other emerging technologies in the digital realm. So the US has a historical opportunity to play a leading role in building this global digital architecture, governance framework, and the rules of the game. However, the US will require like-minded partners to help shape this new terrain and to establish the new rules for this new era. If the US does this well, it will entrench US global leadership for another generation. The US has a head start, and it will be a pity if the US is not able to exercise the power of its example to bring about a more integrated, connected, secure, and inclusive digital world. It will be a pity. Now, my third sharing today, the third proposition is that beyond the government, large tech companies also have a responsibility to help architect a more open, connected, and inclusive digital global e-commerce. And so to all the audience in this webinar today, from the big corporates, never underestimate the power of influence of large tech companies in shaping this new world order. And to those with great powers come great responsibilities. For example, in 2019, Apple would have been the world's 15th largest economy by GDP if Apple was a country. And according to the 2019 UN Conference on Trade and Development report, Google alone accounts for 90% of the market for internet searches, and Facebook accounts for 2/3 of global social media. It's important for all these digital giants to work together to help resist the tide of digital protectionism, compete fairly, and address the perception that data is a zero-sum finite resource. So the fate of the global economy is not the responsibility of governments alone. Corporate leadership must partner and complement government for enlightened self-interest and also for humanity's greater good. Now, to seize the real potential of the digital connectivity, I think we can all find ways to manage the challenges surrounding digital integration. And key to this will be rulemaking, the establishment of a set of rules to guide the development in this area. Clear, transparent rules reduce uncertainties around data privacy, cybersecurity, and promote a fair level playing field. And in the long run, it will also create greater harmonization and interoperability between digital markets. So it's up to government in close consultation with our stakeholders, including the digital giants, to define the rules of the game. And it will require consensus building and policy making at the international level. So to this end, Singapore welcomes the US effort to set a high standard set of rules on trade with like-minded partners. For instance, your agreement with between the US, Mexico, and Canada, and the US-Japan Digital Trade Agreement. Singapore has adopted a similar approach. We have secured a Pathfinder bilateral digital economic agreement with Australia and a trilateral digital economic partnership agreement with Chile and New Zealand. These agreements expand on familiar elements in FTA e-commerce chapters relating to digitalization in traditional trade. They also address emerging issues in the digital domain, such as the development of artificial intelligence technologies and governance frameworks for digital identities. So moving forward, we look forward to continuing cooperation with the US to advance our shared agenda on deepening global digital connectivity and writing new rules for the digital economy. Singapore and US has a long-standing and significant economic set of ties. We were the first Asian country to conclude a bilateral free trade agreement with the US in 2004, which facilitated over more than $131 billion worth of trade in goods and services in 2019 alone. And today, Singapore is one of the largest Asian investors in the US. Conversely, many US digital giants, such as Facebook and Amazon, have established their regional headquarters in Singapore, not just to service the Singapore market, but to use Singapore as a platform to service the regional and global markets. So at the WTO, we look forward to the US continued support of the Joint Statement Initiative on E-commerce, or JSI as we call it, which Singapore together with Japan and Australia co-convene. And the US active engagement in this issue has been instrumental in moving the membership forward to consider other frontier issues. So we look forward to working with the US, both at the bilateral and at the multilateral level. And with that, three propositions, I'll be happy to further discuss this with the audience. Thank you. Thank you, Anabel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister, for sharing with us those very enlightening three propositions and that very well frame our discussion. Let me now turn over to Caroline and ask you, what are, in your view, the main barriers facing digital trade today? And is there a role, as Minister Chun was saying, for the private sector in working with governments to address those challenges? And welcome, Caroline.
Thanks very much, Anabel, and thank you very much, Minister. You laid out many of the issues beautifully, and I love your three propositions. I just want to pull back and make Two comments before I turn to your question, Anabel. The first one is just a reminder about how huge the growth in the internet, in electronic transmissions and subscriptions has been. At the end of the 1990s, just before the turn of this century, there were 1 million broadband connections. Right now, there are 7 billion subscriptions to broadband around the world. That is really almost hard to fathom, I think, the growth. There are 4 billion people connected to the internet, and really importantly for your questions about growth, there are 100 million businesses that are connected around the world, even though much of the digital trade comes from just a much smaller number of countries. Now, my other comment, which is perhaps a slightly gloomier way of looking at what the minister has laid out, is that you had this great title for this session, which is "Can Digital Trade Promote, the next round of growth?" I always think we have to turn it on its head. I think we're in great danger of a retreat. We've seen, and the numbers I laid out show how enormous the growth in digital trade has been. It's got faster as time has gone on, as there have been more and more developments, more and more businesses coming online, and so on. But what we've been seeing more recently, in addition to the very good initiatives that the minister referred to, we've actually seen on the ground growing inhibitions on data transmission and on digital trade. And I think that what those of us who believe that digital trade can be managed, or not managed maybe, but can be promoted in a way that is for the good of society, what we need to be thinking about is how do we hold back the backsliding, if you like, even more than how do we use digital trade to promote the next burst of growth. So, because left alone, I think digital trade does a lot. And what we're seeing, instead of it being left alone, is a lot of barriers. So I don't want to take too much time at the beginning, but just to lay out a few of those barriers. And I think they fall into different categories. Some of them are regulatory, importantly about antitrust and concerns about the powers of some of the big companies, as the minister mentioned. And there have been various attempts, including more recently in the United States and in the past and now, to consider whether the power of the private sector companies is too large to be good. And I think that's mostly a regulatory question, but it moves into a next big point, which is economic nationalism. And certainly when I was at Google, and I went to Singapore again, and that was great, but I also went to Europe many times, and I discovered there that there was an enormous resentment against the importance of and the size of the American tech companies. And of course, we've more recently seen economic nationalism from the United States. I think that is springs out of the 10, 12 years of slower growth, continued high employment until earlier this year, following the financial crisis. But it's not only that, it's a sense that there are these big companies that are mostly American, although increasingly also Chinese. And then the last point I would make on where do these barriers come from is a cultural one. Obviously, one can see different culture between China and the United States, and then there are many other complications in that relationship. But one of the areas that we tend not to talk about so much is Europe. Culturally, maybe close to the United States in many ways, but actually the place where there has been a lot of resistance to digital trade and to the acceptance of digital trade. And part of that is a cultural issue about the importance of privacy. And we all are aware of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, and so on from Europe. But it's not just about privacy. One of the other barriers, if you like, has been on copyright reform, which was introduced in Europe a couple of years ago. And again, some of these regulations are a little bit hard for companies and individuals to figure out how they will affect trade, because they're left to individual countries in the European Union to put into place. But those cultural differences, you know, in the United States, is a very different attitude to whether private companies have your data from the attitude in Europe. And I think that those can lead to barriers as well. And the reason I want to look at Europe in particular is you mentioned, Anabel, at the beginning, that digital e-commerce has really expanded during COVID. And obviously so have virtual meetings and Zoom calls and everything. But the numbers you gave for the expansion in Europe were much smaller than the numbers in Asia and in the United States. And that's partly about the availability. It's partly about the ease of doing e-commerce business. And maybe it's also a little bit about some cultural resistance. So just quickly, and I'm sure we'll come into this in more detail, some of the main barriers, I think, are a really important barrier is data localization. And that has been an issue that's been around for ages, whereby countries say, if you want to operate in our country or work with our citizens, we need to have the data stored so that we can access it as well. That has been an issue that the internet companies have said is a barrier to trade because it adds to costs and so on. It's not very efficient to have data servers all around the place. But I think there's a more recently, and this is part of my concern about the trajectory that we're on at the moment. More recently, that concern has, or those data localization changes have moved to being not so much you need to keep your data in our country on our servers, but you should only have data on our citizens in our country on our servers. And that further step makes it very difficult, is really a challenge, if you like, to the broader issue of globalization and multinational companies. Because if you're a multinational company, you have, for example, a very obvious thing is you have a database on your employees. If you cannot have a database on your employees that is unified, because you can only keep the information on American employees in the United States, you can only keep French employees in France, you can only keep Singapore employees' information in Singapore, then obviously that's a challenge just to the basic management of multinational companies. And I think that that is an area that is worth watching. So data localization is huge. I mentioned copyright. That can also be an inhibition, and we can talk about that more. Obviously, privacy. And just now we've had a big challenge, or there is a big challenge at the moment to the free flow of data across the Atlantic between Europe and the United States, because the European Court has just ruled in favor of Schrems. And there are other ways that companies can have contracts to support the data, flow of data. But this is something that is very basic for digital trade. And it's not about internet companies. It's about financial companies. It's about any company that is trying to do trade. So that is also a big issue. And then obviously, there is the issue, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later, on taxation. And the minister mentioned, how do you get fiscal revenues? I've got quite strong, somewhat controversial views about that, but we can come to it. Finally, to your question, well, what's the role of the private sector, or should the private sector be involved? And I agree with the minister, absolutely. Yes, the private sector should be involved and must be involved in trying to help there be good rules of the road. One of the things that struck me when I was at Google was an engineer early on said to me when we were talking about actually the issue of what content is allowed online about children. And he said, it would be good if we knew what the goals of policymakers were, and then we could engineer around that. But what gets a mess is when the policymakers try to come up with the engineering fix, which often, you know, understandably, they may not know quite how the technology works, or even some basic things about the technology, and so that can lead to a problem. And I think the private sector now. Two problems with that endorsement of private sector involvement. One is that, especially given the other issues that we've both talked about, and the size and country dominant, you know, US-China issues in where the big companies are, I think there will naturally be some political suspicion about what are the interests of the companies. Are they telling it right? And that's always the case with the business lobby. I mean, it's not special about the internet. It's the case with every big sector, pharma, oil and gas, whatever, auto manufacturing, whatever it may be. But I think perhaps one of the issues that makes it a bit complicated is that the gap in understanding between the two worlds may be a bit greater in the context of technology, maybe. The other issue is that my experience, and obviously this is changing, but these companies, these very big companies, are very new. They grew up and expanded and became very large very quickly. And they're only more recently recognizing that as big corporations, you kind of have a job of social responsibility. You are a player in a country. And that is anathema, certainly, or was anathema to the founders in the United States, who tended to be more libertarian in Silicon Valley. You know, if they thought about a government, what they basically wanted to do was run away from it or push it away. So their DNA is not really well suited to take into account and to figure out strategies. They tend to, I had this saying after I'd worked in Silicon Valley, and with apologies to my former colleagues, that people talk about being in a bubble. And I did discover that when you go into Silicon Valley, and obviously everything's different now with COVID, but just sort of landing in San Francisco and driving down to Palo Alto, you do start to feel, maybe it's the sunshine or something, but you start to feel possibilities. You start to feel, you know, the creativity in the air, the concerns of politicians and people sort of fall away a bit, and that you can be surrounded by the Silicon Valley bubble. And it's actually quite a hard bubble to pierce, as we've seen, you know.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Caroline, for also for some great reflections on barriers and the role of business. And we've touched upon many topics, but let me come back to Minister Chun and ask you, so Caroline was referring to a number of barriers and data localization, for example. So I wanted to ask you, are some of these agreements that Singapore is negotiating, do they include provisions to address some of these barriers?
Well, Anabel, we take a slightly different approach compared to many other big countries. For a start, we are a small country. We believe that we shouldn't have such barriers like data localization, because like what Caroline suggested, any multinational corporation will need to flow its data back and forth across different countries in order for it to make sense of the world and produce better products and services. I would say that even as big a country as China, as their digital giant grow, they will also need data from elsewhere to enrich their product offerings. So for us, in all the digital agreements that we sign, and in our agreements and discussions with the digital giants, the companies, not just the countries, we will always have an open posture towards the flow of data. I think what we need to help many countries understand is this. And if I may just follow on from where Caroline left off, let's ask the question, why are countries afraid of the free flow of data? Why are they afraid? And listening to Caroline and from my own experience, I summarize them into 5 different factors. And for each of these 5 different factors, I think the private sector has a role to help this government to get their thinking straight. The first group of countries that do not like the free flow of data is actually paralyzed by fear. They really do not know what goes in and come out, and some of them do not have the expertise to do this. So they require people to help them understand what this all means. But this is probably the smallest subset of the countries. The second set of countries that do not like this has to do with the fear of adjustments. Because as I mentioned, both globalization and digitalization will change the structure of the domestic economy. And it requires adjustments. It requires the political will and resources to help those who need to adjust to make those adjustments. And it can be companies, it can be workers. But when workers and companies are not helped to make the adjustments and are left to fend for themselves, and they don't see the benefits of neither globalization nor digitalization flowing down to them, then there's a natural pushback. The third set of countries that are not so in favor of a free flow of data is because they think that they can get some money, fiscal revenue, out from controlling the data. Never mind the increasing rate of return. It is just, I have this, I want to control this, and it's scary when they say that data is the new oil. Because when they say data is the new oil, I don't think they mean lubricant, as in lubricating the global economy. I think they mean this is a resource that I have, and if I have it, you can't have it. It's a zero-sum game. So I get very fearful when I hear this. So I mean, let's be frank. I mean, as particularly big countries that generate lots of data, I think there's some sense that they can get some money out from this. Then the fourth set of countries have to do with security, real or perceived. That if data goes to another country, they lost something and they lost control. But this is not exactly new. If we listen to what Caroline has shared, actually, even before this couple of years, financial institutions have been flowing data across borders. Well, it could be in an Excel spreadsheet physically printed on paper many years ago. Today, we just do it with the press of the button. But to even the last century, when we trade and we exchange data, we exchange trade data, we exchange cargo manifests, those are all data, right? But so why is there this sudden fear that it will suddenly increase our vulnerability because of the security loopholes? There are security issues that we need to address for mutual assurance, but I don't think it is a binary situation whereby we never had security issues in the past, and now because of digital, we have all kinds of security issues. It's never like that. But the last point is interesting. The last group of people are actually afraid of their local economy being dominated by an external player. It could be the Chinese, it could be the Americans, it could be the Europeans, digital giant. And then we need a new way to manage this set of issues. How do we avoid a situation where a country, particularly small countries, are held ransom by a dominant digital giant? And the correct way to look at this from our perspective is to make sure that we are very clear how we can lower the barriers of entry. In the digital economy, we cannot apply the previous competitive concepts only based on the current size and dominance of the market. Actually, a more important yardstick is the ease of entry for potential competitors. And it is the ease of entry that will help check the dominance of any digital giant. And from Singapore's perspective as a small country, the reason why we welcome more internet players, more digital giants into Singapore to set up their base here is because we believe that with diversity of choices, our chances of being captured and held ransom by anyone is actually lowered. So we have 80% of all of the top 100 tech internet firms in the world have a presence in Singapore. And that is our greatest assurance against any regulatory capture or any other untoward thing happening to us, because we have choices, and from the choices, we are able to level up our knowledge and know what we can do and cannot do. And with that kind of rich ecosystem, it actually assures us much more than if we had been dependent on one or two providers, be it domestic or foreign.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Minister, for this very thoughtful comments. To address some of the barriers that Carolyn was referring to, and also to mitigate some of the fears that you were mentioning that underpin some of the restrictions that we are seeing. Arguably, the best place to develop rules would be at the global level, because of course, data knows no frontiers from a technological perspective. And nevertheless, and I'm going to bring in a question from our audience here, from specialist Pierre Taubé, who basically says that global digital governance will require the leadership not only of the US, but greater convergence among the world's 3 digital rulemaking nations, the US, EU, and China. So how can we entice these players to opt for integration rather than fragmentation? And how much convergence is feasible in the context of the rising tech tensions? And let me add to this, what kind of agreement could we expect for members to deliver in the WTO, where they are discussing these issues amidst this great divergence of views on privacy, data localization, cybersecurity, and so many topics. So maybe, Caroline, I'm going to bring you in for a few minutes, and then, Minister, I would also like to hear your views on this topic. Caroline.
Thanks very much, Anabel. Well, ideally, there would be global agreement. I think that what's most important is agreement, as you mentioned, amongst the biggest players. As usual, Singapore, which has always been extremely helpful as a small country, but a small country at the cutting edge of many trade issues. And I well remember being in G20 meetings where, whether on climate or trade or whatever, Singapore would have a way to bridge a lot of gaps. And so it absolutely is important to have some smaller countries that are advanced in these ways to be part of that. But I have to say that I'm a bit gloomy about what can be done or what will be done, not so much on, the issue of, well, will there be customs duties put on global flows, but on these other more insidious maybe concerns and the other kinds of barriers that I have mentioned. And the reason, going to these lovely 5 points that the Minister laid out, I think it's pretty difficult to think of a sort of global solution that addresses all of those points without a really big buy-in by at least the United States and China, and then also Europe in a somewhat different way, buy into the importance and the basic notion that the Minister laid out at the beginning, which is that it's not a zero-sum game. And just a couple of sort of recent developments that I'd also be interested in the Minister's comments on it. One is, in Europe, well, when I was at Google, I talked a lot to Europeans about the digital single market that they were promoting in the previous commission. But the digital single market seemed to me to be much more about imposing rules and barriers than lifting rules and barriers. And in fact, one of the main German policymaker at that point said to me, we need to get a handle on the internet, we need to establish a regime, and then we need to have rules to govern the regime. And I was thinking that is absolutely not the way that technology develops. But right now we have France and Germany establishing an ambition of a so-called European cloud, Gaia X. And you have to wonder, what is a European cloud? Because there are already cloud services that many European countries obviously use. But the companies are headquartered and have been developing either in the United States or in China. So is it that, that they want European ownership of a cloud, or what exactly? I think it's not really clear. I think they just, there's an analogy mentally, at any rate, with, well, having you know, an aircraft manufacturer that is based in Europe versus, or headquartered one place rather than another place, taxed one place rather than another place. So I think the move is unfortunately in the other direction, from a global understanding that there is a positive sum game. Then on the United States side, again, just on cloud, there is a thing called, I think it's FedRAMP or something like that, which determines how much or which companies can bid for or obtain, or what are the conditions for getting contracts from the federal government, which is very important. And they have a raising level of security required. And that again is pushing for more data localization and so on. So, and then we haven't even discussed the issues of cybersecurity, which I think are very genuine concerns for many countries, and bring in, you know, players such as Russia, North Korea, Iran, which are not normally part, well, Russia's part of the G20. So I do, sorry to be a sort of Debbie Downer, but I do think that there are big problems in bringing together the global forces. Just on the optimistic side, I think it can be done, but it really requires a change of attitude. And maybe that goes back to the minister's first or second proposition, which was, what is the United States going to do? Are we going to take a sort of proactive and pro digital trade role? I'm just not sure that the body politic is going to be ready for that, at least for some time.
Thank you, Caroline. In that same venue, we have Huan Yu, who asking, any global agreement on digital trade that includes China needs to rebuild trust in Beijing. Is it possible under the current environment? Which fills into this question as, can we expect really to bring the USEU and China together on this topic? Minister, what do you think?
I would agree with Caroline that for us to achieve and obtain a global agreement in the short term will be very challenging. But my belief is that we don't have to try to boil the whole ocean at the same time. When we had our agreements with Australia, Chile, New Zealand, and other partners whom we are talking about, we adopted a modular approach. We accepted as a starting point that different countries have different degrees of what we call digital maturity. And different countries would like to join the digital economic partnership agreements with different modules. And because of that, we adopted a modular approach to work with countries on the modules that they are most ready to do so. And if we are able to demonstrate the benefits from that set of limited objectives, it will build confidence for them to adopt subsequent modules with us. So that's our approach. It starts off with a bilateral, a plurilateral approach, and it's a modular approach. So it's not the same agreement with everybody, because the digital needs and the digital maturity is just different between different sets of countries. So that's one starting point. A second point about, yes, it's indeed important for the US and the Chinese to provide the leadership, and probably together with Europe. But I always share with my Chinese and the US friends that while the US and the Chinese economy combined is 1/3 of the global economy, there's another 2/3 of the global economy out there. And the contest between the US and China is not who beats the other fella within the 1/3 context. It is really who can take on a much more progressive posture to win over the other 2/3 of the world. That's the real contest. And if both US, China, or for that matter, Europe, look at it from that perspective, it makes absolute economic sense and geopolitical sense for them to step forward, to lean forward, take leadership, and provide the world with options to convince the world that their standards is the one that is most progressive and able to meet the security demands, the cybersecurity needs, the economic needs of the world. So at this point in time, I always encourage both the US and the Chinese not to look at each other's through their own lenses and think that the other guy together with him is the entire universe of what is achievable. In fact, the rest of the 2/3 of the world, including Singapore being part of the 2/3, we are all looking, I'm sure together with many other countries, for the leadership amongst the EU, China, and the US. And that is where I think it goes back to my second proposition. Whoever can command the respect of the world to convince them that they have the most progressive system to help uplift the economies of the rest of the world in the next lap, I think the rest of the world will follow that particular standard. So we have a competition, not a bilateral competition. Actually, it is a competition and yet cooperation to level up the standards of behavior in the digital space for everyone. So I would adopt a modular approach, and I would strongly encourage many of the big countries to look at how they can command the respect of the world by adopting the progressive policies. And this is where it links back to the previous point about the role of the digital giants. They too have a role to set the standards of transparency, security, to assure the 2/3 of the world and the 1/3 of the world that their system is an open system that can be trusted. And it is not just about the government setting policies. It is also manifested by the standards set by the digital giants. I'm quite sure every digital giant would like to operate in both the US and the Chinese market, and of course the European market. Then the question is, will any of the digital giant be allowed to establish that standard and code of behavior that will be a role model for the rest? And if we let the market decide on this, perhaps many of the issues can be resolved a bit easier than letting the politicians decide on this, which is why I thought if we start from the basis of economics and technology, we might be a little bit better. And of course, I'm biased. I graduated in economics, and I was always told that if economists run the world, it will be a better place.
Thank you very much, Minister. So this proposition of yours of a race to the top, and how can the different actors really sort of push the rest of the world to go there, I think is an interesting one. And certainly it would be great if we had some politicians listening to you at this point in time. We have, unfortunately, because you've raised so many interesting points on global cooperation, the advantages of global cooperation for growth in this area. We've also just mentioned a few things on the role of the giants, and then competition policy, and governments wanting to bring in digital state taxes. It's almost impossible to cover all of these topics in such a short time frame. But we're getting close to an end, and I would like to bring you in, Caroline, and ask one specific question to you, and then come back to the minister as well with another specific question. So for you, Caroline, Do you think there is a case for a digital trade tax? In 2 minutes.
No. I think there is a really important issue about international or multinational companies paying tax, paying an appropriate level of tax globally. I think it's really important to for individual countries, and I strongly support the OECD work on base erosion and profit shifting on BEPS, to squeeze out the locales where companies are encouraged to put their headquarters or part of them in order to avoid, if not evade, taxes, corporate taxes. So I think there have been some steps towards that, including there's many things wrong with the 2017 tax bill, but one step forward was to say there should be some minimum tax wherever companies make profits. I think a digital tax, I understand the politics behind it. The minister talked about that a little bit, but it's like shooting yourself in the foot. If you have digital the economy can help everybody, including, as you mentioned, women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, small businesses. If you put a special tax on that part of the economy, you discourage it inevitably. And if you can do a sort of value-added type tax if you want to on those transactions, fine. It just makes them more expensive. But to shift taxes to tax where users are, to do corporate taxation on the basis of where users are is really bizarre. It's like taxing Mercedes in China or something, where people are buying Mercedes, or maybe Louis Vuitton, I should say. So it's not an appropriate response to the two problems, one of which is a sense that big tech companies don't pay enough tax, although actually I have to say that they probably pay more tax in relation to profits than many other non-tech companies. Google, for example, used to pay, over 5 years, paid nearly 20% of its profits in taxation, way higher than many multinationals based in Europe. And it flies in the face of the idea that, yes, digital commerce is good for fairness in society. So I think it's the wrong solution to what is an understandable problem.
Okay. So I think we're going to need an episode of Trade Winds exclusively dedicated to this point. So thank you very much, Caroline, for sharing your views on this topic. Minister, I want to bring you with a final question on how to make digital trade more inclusive. Both across countries, and we have a question here from Hildegun Kibik Nordas about Africa, for example, but also within countries. The point that we were mentioning, women, the youth, and others. So, can we make digital trade more inclusive?
Yes, I think we can. Within a country, any political system, if it wants its people to accept and embrace the digital world, must have the political will and master the political resources to help its people make the necessary adjustments. Now, that is the responsibility within a country. And very often when countries don't do that well, they pin the blame on trade. And now they pin the blame on digital trade and digital transactions. So I think within a country, it is incumbent upon the leadership to master the resources to help its people to make the adjustments. Now, what about those countries, say, they are less able to do so within their countries? And this is the part whereby I think some of the large corporations can play a role, partly in education, partly in outreach, but ultimately to understand that if they want to penetrate a market, perhaps not so well endowed, not so well organized, it is also in their interest to help the people in the market to understand the potential and make the necessary adjustments. And we have seen big corporations, including digital giants, making these efforts. You can call it corporate social responsibility, or you can even just call it good market practice, where you want to develop markets, you want to develop your consumers. And that, I think, from an enlightened self-interest perspective, there's great scope for us to work together on this. I perfectly accept it's very difficult for resources to be transferred between countries on the scale that's required. But if a digital giant is penetrating a less developed market and it spends a bit to help the country and to develop that market, I think it will pay dividend in the long run. And it's just part of market development for people to accept and embrace the potential within the digital economy. So my sense is that, yes, it has to be done, and yet it can be done, but you will need political will to get this done.
All right, thank you very much, Minister. On this note, on a call for self-interest and enlightenment on the part of the giants, I would like to thank both you, Minister Chun and Caroline, for a wonderful discussion. I really need to say that I'm only very sorry that we have reached our time, because there are indeed so many topics that we could continue discussing. But you have really brought many interesting points to our conversation, and I'm sure that our audience is also very grateful to both of you. So thank you. I also would like to thank our audience for joining us as always. Thank you very much for all your questions. We were not able, of course, to address all of them, but I will share them with both Minister Chun and Caroline so that they know what is on your mind. Please stay tuned for our next episode of Trade Winds. It will come on Wednesday, October 7th, and I look forward to seeing you all of you on that opportunity. So until then, thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you very much, Anabel.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, Minister Chun.